Hey friends, it's your teen and tween librarian Rebecca, and we're back for another episode of Bedtime Stories. Last episode, we saw an enormous, crazy fight between an ichthyosaurus and a plesiosaurus. Now, I don't know about you, but this may have been the first grouping of prehistoric animals that Axel mentions that I actually knew what they were. So it was awesome to be able to read that whole fight and kind of be able to picture it. I don't know if anybody else is there as a dinosaur fan, but it was a lot of fun for me. So we're going to continue on and find out what happens after this epic fight and where is their raft going to go next. Join me for chapter 34. Chapter 34. The Great Geyser. Wednesday, the 19th of August. Fortunately, the wind, which is blowing hard, has enabled us to get away quickly from the scene of the battle. Hans is still at the tiller, and my uncle, whom the fight had distracted from his all-absorbing thoughts, has returned to his impatient examination of the sea. The voyage has resumed its uniform tenor, which I have no desire to see disturbed by dangers such as we underwent yesterday. Thursday, the 20th of August. Wind north-northeast, variable. Temperature high, speed about 9 knots. Towards midday we heard a very distant noise, a continuous roar which I could not identify. "There must be some rock or islet in the distance," said the professor, "against which the sea is breaking." Hans climbed to the top of the mast, but could not make out any reef. The ocean stretched away unbroken to the skyline. 3 hours went by. The roar seemed to be coming from a distant waterfall. I said as much to my uncle, who shook his head. At the same time, I felt sure that I was right, and wondered whether we might not be sailing towards some cataract which would hurl us into the abyss. I had no doubt that this method of descent would please the professor, because it would be nearly vertical, but for my part. At any rate, there was definitely a very noisy phenomenon a good few miles to leeward, for now the roaring noise was clearly audible. Did it come from the sky or the sea? I looked up at the vapors hanging in the atmosphere and tried to penetrate their depths. The sky was calm. The clouds, as high up in the vault as they could go, seemed motionless and almost invisible in the bright glare of the light. It was therefore necessary to look elsewhere for the explanation of the phenomenon. I then examined the horizon, which was unbroken and free from mist. Its appearance had not changed in any way. But if the noise came from a waterfall, a cataract, if the whole sea was flowing into a lower basin, if that roar was produced by a mass of falling water, then there was bound to be a current, and its increasing speed would give me the measure of the danger threatening us. I consulted the current. It was nil. I threw an empty bottle into the sea. It lay still. About 4 o'clock, Hans stood up, clutched hold of the mast, and climbed up to the top again. From that position his eyes swept the horizon in front of the raft and stopped at a certain point. His face showed no surprise, but his eyes remained motionless. "He has seen something," said my uncle. "Yes, I do believe he has." Hans came down and stretched his arm out to the south, saying, "Der nere." "Over there?" replied my uncle. Seizing his telescope, he gazed hard for a minute, which seemed an age to me. "Yes, yes," he cried. "What can you see?" "A huge jet of water rising above the waves." "Another sea monster?" "Perhaps." "Then let us steer more to the west, because we know now how dangerous those antediluvian monsters are." "No, let us go straight ahead," replied my uncle. I turned to Hans, but he held his tiller with inflexible determination. Yet if at the distance which separated us from the animal, a distance I estimated at 30 miles at least, we could see the column of water expelled by its blowers, then it must be of supernatural dimensions. The most ordinary prudence would dictate immediate flight, but we had not come so far to be so prudent. We therefore pressed on. The nearer we got to the jet, the bigger it seemed. What monster, we wondered, could take in such a quantity of water and shoot it out without a moment's interruption? At 8 o'clock in the evening, we were less than 5 miles from it. Its huge, dark, hillocky body lay in the sea like an island. Illusion, or fear, gave me the impression that it was over a mile long. What could this cetacean be, which neither Cuvier nor Blumenbach knew anything about? It was motionless and apparently asleep. The sea seemed to be incapable of moving it, and it was the waves that lapped against its sides. The column of water, thrown up to a height of 500 feet, was falling in the form of rain with a deafening roar. And there we were, speeding like lunatics towards that powerful monster which 100 whales a day would be insufficient to satisfy. Terror seized me. I refused to go any farther and swore that I would cut the halyards if necessary. I expressed my mutinous feelings to the professor, but he made no reply. All of a sudden, Hans stood up, pointing at the menacing object, and said, "Holma." "An island?" cried my uncle. "An island?" I said with a skeptical shrug of the shoulders. "Why, yes," replied the professor, roaring with laughter. "But that column of water?" "Geyser," said Hans. "Yes, of course, it must be a geyser," said my uncle. "A geyser like those in Iceland." At first, I refused to believe that I had been so grossly mistaken as to take an islet for a sea monster. But the proof was there before me, and finally I had to admit my error. What we could see was just a natural phenomenon. As we drew nearer, the dimensions of the liquid column were revealed as truly magnificent. The islet looked exactly like a huge cetacean whose head was 60 feet above the waves. The geyser, a word which means fury, rose majestically on one end. Now and then we could hear muffled explosions, and the enormous jet, seized with a more violent rage, shook its vaporous plume and shot up as far as the lowest stratum of the clouds. It was all alone. There were no wreaths of steam, no hot springs around it, and all the volcanic power of the island was concentrated in its jet. The rays of electric light mingled with that dazzling sheaf of liquid, every drop of which took on all the colors of the spectrum. "Let us land," said the professor. We had to be careful to avoid the waterspout, which could have sunk the raft in a moment. Steering skillfully, Hans brought us to the end of the islet. I jumped onto the rock, and my uncle followed nimbly, while the guide remained at his post, like a man above curiosity. We found ourselves walking on granite mingled with siliceous tufa. The ground was trembling under our feet, like the sides of an overheated boiler full of steam. It was burning hot. We came in sight of a little central basin from which the geyser rose. I plunged a thermometer into the boiling water. It registered 160 degrees centigrade. This water was coming from a blazing furnace, and this was in complete contradiction with Professor Liedenbrock's theories. I could not refrain from pointing this out to him. "Well," he said, "what does that prove against my theory?" "Nothing," I said curtly, seeing as I was faced with absolute stubbornness. All the same, I was forced to admit that we had been singularly favored so far, and that for some reason which escaped me, we had traveled in perfectly tolerable conditions of temperature. But it struck me as obvious and certain that some day or other we would reach regions where the eternal heat attained the highest limits, and went beyond the temperature registered by any thermometer. "We shall see." That was all the professor would say, and after naming the volcanic islet after his nephew, he gave the signal to re-embark. I went on looking at the geyser for a few minutes. I noticed that its jet varied in height, sometimes diminishing in force, then shooting up again, a fact I attributed to variations in the pressure of the vapors accumulated in its reservoir. At last we set sail again, skirting the sheer rocks at the southern end of the island. Hans had taken advantage of our absence to put the raft in order. Before putting off, I made a few observations to calculate the distance we had come, and I now note these down in my journal. We have sailed 675 miles from Port Gräuben, and we are 1,550 miles from Iceland, under England. And that's the end of chapter 34.